This is a very important debate that our Parliament is seized with today, and I want to thank the Leader of the Conservative Party and our caucus for bringing this to Parliament. This is actually an example of how this Parliament can fulfill its function, challenging the government, holding them to account for a record which on foreign affairs is quite weak, but also propose methods that allow for better resolutions. And that's what this Opposition Day motion and the proposal of a special committee of Parliament on Canada-China relations is all about. I do want to start off with two reflections, though, Mr. Speaker. The first is today marks 1 year since Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were arrested by Chinese state authorities and detained without charge, without access to a lawyer or to the rule of law. They were arbitrarily detained as a diplomatic response to a lawful extradition arrest performed by Canada, a rule of law country, on behalf of the U.S. and a decision by a U.S. court. So Canada acted with full respect of its rule of law traditions, and China's actions have reflected and reminded us there is no rule of law. We, the Conservatives, and I'm sure I speak for all parliamentarians and all Canadians, we stand in solidarity with the families of the two Michaels. We want their well-being to be safeguarded, and we want to see them return home to Canada as quickly as possible. Today we will be talking about many facets of the Canada-China relationship, many challenges, some opportunities, but we're not going to speak further about the two Michaels out of respect for that case and the need for a resolution. What is promising with this motion, Mr. Speaker, is the specialized committee that we're proposing, all-party, multidisciplinary, able to look at all aspects of the Canada-China relationship, from complex consular cases to national security issues to trade to global affairs, within the context of a committee that can go in camera and respect secret and sensitive information. That is probably the best venue to come up with a plan for a swift resolution for the situation of Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig. So I hope the government takes that into consideration when they consider voting on our motion later today. I hope all members of this House realize this could be an opportunity to actually take the politics out of it, but allow us to do our job, because Canadians are concerned about the well-being of these citizens. Canadians are seized with issues related to China, from the South China Sea Islands, to Huawei, to the situation with the Uyghurs, to China's ambitions in the Arctic as a self-declared near-Arctic state, a new diplomatic term that really didn't exist until they created it. The challenge of the China relationship is the foreign policy challenge that Canada will face over the next generation. So this is a perfect opportunity for a specialized committee of parliamentarians to examine it, to make sure that Canada gets the balance right, Mr. Speaker. The second thing I will say at the outset of my remarks is that there are tremendous opportunities in China, but for those opportunities, many of them business, many of them export-driven, Canada cannot and must not relinquish our unbridled support for the rule of law, for human rights, and for standing up for our allies and friends around the world. In many cases, economic opportunities would not be worth it if Canada has to sacrifice the very values that we're respected for and have been respected for from our Confederation, Mr. Speaker. All governments in the modern era, going back to the Prime Minister's father, have tried to balance the need to engage, trade, do business, help develop parts of China, alongside the need to push on human rights, democratic reform, rule of law, and a higher standard in global affairs. So there is a tremendous opportunity, and I'm frustrated that in recent years, the Communist Party of China seems to be stepping back from their path to engagement as a serious, law-abiding world power. Years ago, before my election to Parliament, I spoke at a business luncheon in Toronto. The law firm I was at, like many exporting companies in Canada, saw the tremendous growth potential in China. The second largest economy, growth rates in the double digits in recent decades. And I got to introduce the ambassador to China at the time, who was speaking to this Toronto business audience. And I used this Chinese proverb, Mr. Speaker. One generation plants the trees, the next generation enjoys the shade. The hard work going into the early development of modern China, started by Pierre Trudeau, continued through all prime ministers, and actually going back to iconic Canadians like Norman Bethune and hundreds upon hundreds of missionaries, Canadian citizens that engage with China. These relationships have planted the trees, done the hard work. We should be enjoying the shade now. When I used that proverb, it ended up being the ambassador's favorite expression, Mr. Speaker, because it gets to the heart of diplomacy. You spend the hard work so that future generations can benefit. Canada has been a leading partner in the development of China from truly a developing country into the world's second largest economy, a global power. We've been there literally on the front with Dr. Bethune, but we've also been there to help with agricultural practices. We've been there with our can-do technology to provide greenhouse gas emission-free power through nuclear generating stations, Mr. Speaker, in a country that's too reliant on coal. We've been there to trade. We've seen pandas come. We've seen trade missions go. We have tremendous companies in financial services, in agriculture, in transportation, leading companies like Manulife, like Bombardier, Agrium, others doing tremendous billions of dollars of business with China in the last decades, Mr. Speaker, and we should be very thankful for that. But we should also be very cautious that in recent years, particularly in light of the 19th National Congress, China has been stepping back from serious engagement on the world stage. The Communist Party has been exerting its influence through all levels of Chinese life, including state-owned enterprises and their global effort. We've seen the Belt and Road Initiative allow countries to be beholden on a debt level to China for infrastructure and other projects, Mr. Speaker. We have to be cautious with the turn that China has taken in the last 10 years. And rather than this generation walking in the shade of the trees that were planted in the past, Mr. Speaker, we're now almost lost in the woods on how best to handle this important relationship without sacrificing Canadian values. And why do we bring this debate on our first opposition motion? Because we've had serious concerns with the Prime Minister's ability to govern in Canada's national interest on the world stage. All Canadians now literally have no confidence in the Prime Minister when he goes abroad. You know, we used to bemoan the fact that Canada would never be talked about on the world stage, Mr. Speaker. Now you can't see a late-night talk show or Saturday Night Live and not see our Prime Minister lampooned for actions on the world stage that are gaffes that actually hurt Canada's national interest. At the NATO meetings, the Prime Minister mocking the US President, the very person that we need to help apply pressure for the release of our citizens in China, Mr. Speaker. That's right. At a very time where NATO is being questioned by the President of France, by the US President, and Canada could play its traditional role as a linchpin as Winston Churchill described us, between Europe and North America. We're a G7 nation, we're a NATO nation, we're a NORAD nation, we're a Five Eyes nation. Canada's never the biggest, but we have those relationships that normally we could use to influence our national interest and the freedom and liberty of others and the interests of the Western Alliance, Mr. Speaker. That is eroded. Canada is now seen probably best represented by the Prime Minister's state visit to India, where he puts photographs, his brand, and the Liberal Party's fortunes ahead of Canada's national interest. And with respect to China, our concerns have been grounded in the very earliest actions of this government. And I'm hoping many of the new Liberal members of Parliament listen, because their role now in caucus is to ask questions. They should be just as worried as we are when it comes to China. A former Canadian ambassador to China, David Mulroney, has called the Prime Minister's approach to China naive. And I would agree, Mr. Speaker. I won't make much of his comments before the election where he said he had admiration for the basic dictatorship. It was largely seen as, I'm not sure if it was a joke or just that's how it was received, because it was such a ridiculous answer. But the influence of a very pro-Beijing element of the Prime Minister's core team was evidenced right in their earliest days. The Liberal transition team in 2015 was led by the President of the Canada-China Business Council. He's now sitting in the Senate at the appointment of the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. In May of 2016, so the first year of the government, the Prime Minister was revealed to be in some cash for access fundraisers with major figures, oligarch-type level people with close ties to the Chinese state, Mr. Speaker, and it was revealed, thinking back, I remember my friend from Red Deer Lacombe was bringing it up in the House with great delivery, Mr. Speaker. Not only were the Liberal Party coffers being filled, a $200,000 donation was made to the Trudeau Foundation by a wealthy business person connected to the Chinese state. In fact, money was put aside for a statue to Pierre Trudeau, Mr. Speaker. These are the earliest days. What also happened in the first few months of this government? They reversed a decision that stopped the sale of a technology company to a Chinese-controlled company, Mr. Speaker. In fact, late in the Harper government, the sale of ITF technology to ONET Communications was blocked by the Conservative government on security grounds. There's direct energy, research and development, could be weaponized, could be militarized. The sale was stopped, Mr. Speaker, in July 2015. Within the first few months of the Liberal government, they set aside the blocking of that transaction, Mr. Speaker, and a few months later, approved that sale with military-related technology to a Chinese state enterprise. Do you not think our Five Eyes allies noticed that, Mr. Speaker? It was seen as reversing a responsible security decision by the previous Conservative government out of the new Prime Minister's desire to engage with China towards a free trade agreement, Mr. Speaker. It didn't end there. The next year, they approved the sale of Norsat to Hytera, another Chinese-controlled enterprise, Mr. Speaker, leading to outrage from the Pentagon, which had contracts with this Canadian military communications company, Mr. Speaker. In fact, a trade commissioner in the U.S., a Democrat appointed by Obama, said this about the sale, quote, "Canada's approval of the sale of Norsat to a Chinese entity raises significant national security concerns for the United States, as the company is a supplier to our military. Canada may be willing to jeopardize its own security interests to gain favor with China, but it shouldn't put the security of a close ally at risk in the process," end quote. Commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, a Democrat appointed by the bromance partner of our Prime Minister, President Obama. So this isn't agitating language, Mr. Speaker. These are serious concerns that were brought up to our Foreign Affairs Committee when we traveled to Washington. So right off the bat, we saw the ability to sweep through sales that likely should have been stopped on security grounds in order to curry favor in the relationship, Mr. Speaker. There's also a significant number of human rights concerns. I've raised in the House this week millions of people over the last few months protesting on the streets of Hong Kong, Mr. Speaker. The government has been virtually silent on that. There are 300,000 Canadians living there, Mr. Speaker. 78 years ago this week, Canadians from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles were fighting in defense of Hong Kong. We lost hundreds in the battle that ended on Christmas Day, and we lost hundreds more in POW camps in Japan, Mr. Speaker. So we have not only our national interest, our citizens, but our blood represented in Hong Kong, and the government has been reserved in its comment. They've also been reserved in their comment on the very, very disturbing internment and re-education of up to 1 million Uyghurs, Mr. Speaker. This is an area where we must be able to balance our values as a country and the need for us to speak out with that commercial interest, Mr. Speaker. Under this Prime Minister, all of the other issues have taken a back seat. In fact, before his state visit there in 2016, they were pre-positioning for a free trade agreement announcement, Mr. Speaker. So it's clear that the commercial interest has been overdriving with this Prime Minister and with the Liberal government, and national security issues, the Huawei decision that never comes, Mr. Speaker, our virtual silence on many significant human rights cases, the fact that our Asia-Pacific partners are very worried about the militarization of artificial islands built in the South China Sea, Mr. Speaker. 70% of global trade passes through those waters, Mr. Speaker. Canada, its last Pacific naval visit by one of our frigates was surveilled by China for their whole time there, Mr. Speaker. China's efforts to keep Taiwan off of bodies like the World Health Organization, which is meant to actually stop contagions and spreads around the world, Mr. Speaker, isolating countries like that, Canada once again not being as forceful as we should. So in the last few minutes we are asking for this specialized committee so that we can make progress to have a balanced position on China after 4 years of no balance under this Prime Minister. In the last year alone, since we're acknowledging the year of the detention of our citizens, Conservatives recommended a travel advisory immediately. It took the government 3 months to implement that. We asked within weeks for the Prime Minister to engage directly. He refused and claimed it was just a regular consular case when it was not, Mr. Speaker. By the time he did try and engage, and the previous minister tried to engage, they couldn't get calls returned. We said there was flexibility within the Extradition Act to actually move Ms. Meng's trial to a faster jurisdiction. That would have shown, within the rule of law, within the Act, expedited process in return for favor to our citizens. They did not act there, Mr. Speaker. We called Minister McCallum in camera. I can't talk about it, but I wish it was televised, Mr. Speaker. You can probably understand why he's no longer the ambassador. He contradicted himself several times and had to resign. We wanted an immediate ambassador appointed. They waited until the election to appoint Mr. Barton, Mr. Speaker, with no consultation with opposition parties. We asked them to withdraw Canada's participation in the Infrastructure Bank. We asked them to immediately bring a WTO challenge with respect to canola and other commodities unfairly impacted by trade. They waited until 2 days before an election, delayed 6 months, Mr. Speaker. Our allies are not there for us, Mr. Speaker, because of the current lack of seriousness the Prime Minister has on the world stage. Let me leave you with Mr. McCallum's final comments in this House that could illustrate why we need this committee and why we need to be serious with China. He said this when he was leaving for the assignment. When Canada and China have disagreed, and sometimes that happens, all three Prime Ministers I've served have drawn on the friendship to speak respectfully but frankly to their Chinese counterparts. I know this long tradition will continue, Mr. Speaker." End quote. It did not continue. With this specialized committee, it can continue. We can be serious and have a balanced approach when it comes to China.